Welcome to Hennett Minutes. I'm Greg Hennett. Today's talk is titled The Rule Makers. In Galatians 5:1, Paul wrote to the Galatians and said, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty with which Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." What was he talking about? Well, at the time, the Galatian Christians, most of whom were Gentiles, were going back under the Jewish regulations, specifically Pharisaic rules. Now, they had been saved by the grace of God. They believed that, not by their works, but by Christ's work on the cross. But they had changed. Something had happened. They had submitted to rule makers, specifically, as I said, the Pharisees. Well, what was the problem? The Pharisees were a group of Jews who began about 2 centuries before Christ, and they were reacting to the captivity, the Babylonian captivity. Their solution to that never happening again was they would create certain rules themselves that would circle or fence the law of God with more strict regulations than God himself required. Then the Jews would break their rules before they broke God's law. So they were protecting God's law in their minds. Actually, what they were doing was assuming God's prerogatives. They didn't have the right to make rules for God. God alone has the right to make rules. So it was really an expression of religious pride, great hubris. Now, Jesus realized this, and when he came along, he directly conflicted with them. Instead of submitting to them, he went directly against their regulations, not God's word, but their regulations. And this is what we're trying to point out here in this little video, the difference between the rules God makes and those that men make in his behalf with great solemnity. So, for instance, the Pharisees had rules about washing your hands a certain way before you ate. It's good to wash your hands, but it doesn't have spiritual value in it. They also had very strict rules about the Sabbath. They defined very precisely what work was. God didn't define it very precisely. He just said in the commandments to rest on the Sabbath day, and it should be holy, set apart. So they made very, very careful regulations as to what work was. And one of the things was you were not to work in the fields. You were not to harvest your crops. So when the disciples of Jesus were hungry one day, they gleaned a little wheat and they munched on it. It wasn't a very good lunch, but that's what they had. And so the Pharisees immediately said, "Aha, you're working on the Sabbath day." No, they weren't. That was just an act of mercy where they were hungry and they took some food to satisfy their hunger. Then again, there was a man who needed healing on the Sabbath day, and Jesus was in a synagogue with this man, and he was considering healing him, and the Pharisees looked on him, and they wondered, would he heal him or not? That's work, you know. And so Jesus went right ahead and healed him on the Sabbath day and explained to these hypocrites that if their donkey had fallen into the ditch, they would have helped the donkey out. But they were unwilling to help or unmerciful toward this man who needed healing. So in that case, Jesus was showing them that mercy took priority over their regulations. Well, this is an important matter because rulemaking invariably leads to condemning others. You are free to make your own rules according to your own religious scruples. That's all right. You're not free to bind others and say they must submit to your rules. And I'm addressing now, of course, religious leaders, be they of a church or of a denomination. The other problem is present today, just the opposite. And that's where people won't keep God's rules, New Testament regulations. This is a serious problem. So we have on the one hand, the legalism of the Pharisees then and of the little rule makers today. And on the other hand, the license of those who do not enforce the regulations of the Scriptures. Now, let's define these two terms. Legalism is when religious men and systems require more of God's people than God himself requires. That's legalism. License is just the opposite. It's when the leaders of God's people do not require what God requires, and thus the people are loosed to sin in their minds freely without consequence, but there are consequences, of course, to breaking God's rules. So we have to differentiate. Now, let me just say to you in closing, if any religious organization binds you to an obligation that you cannot see in the Scriptures clearly do not teach it, when it's not clear in your mind, you're not under obligation to keep those rules. This is what Paul was saying to the Galatians. And I would repeat, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty with which Christ has made you free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And watch out for the rule makers.